Well, welcome back to the Bible Reading Challenge podcast. My name is Aaron Ventura, and in this episode, we are going to answer the question, when did polygamy become a sin? In case you were wondering. And this is a follow-up episode to the last one we did on those polygamous patriarchs, wrestling with this concept, this idea that God calls those men, Abraham, Jacob, David, etc., he calls those men righteous. Well, since there were some questions I received after that episode, I thought it would be worthwhile for us to take a deeper look at this question. So there are basically four positions when it comes to when did polygamy become a sin. But before I explain each of those positions, I want to just make one note on vocabulary. So polygamy, it can refer to both what's called polygamy, so that's with an N, and that's a man who has more than one wife at the same time. And this is a different idea than those who would have, let's say you get married, your wife dies, then you marry another woman. So some people say that that's polygamous or serial monogamy of sorts. And that's not what we're talking about here. So polygamy, I'm talking about what is more technically called polygyny and not what is polyandry. So that would be a woman who has more than one husband. That's pretty much universally there's hardly any cultures or nations where this is practiced. However, polygamy with an N is still practiced in many countries today. I actually have a missionary friend in a Muslim region of Africa right now, and polygamy of this sort is common. A man has two wives, and for many of them, it's actually the goal to have up to 4 wives. So this is actually a live issue in missions as the gospel is going into some of these regions where, there's men who have more than one wife. How should we think about this issue? So just for you to know, in this episode, when I say polygamy, yes, I am referring to the more technical definition of polygyny, a man who has more than one wife at the same time. All right, so here are the 4 basic positions on when did polygamy become a sin, and there's probably other positions out there that I've not read every single one, but here's the ones that I have come across. So position 1, polygamy is not a sin. It never has been, and it never will be, even after the New Testament. Polygamy is approved of and or permitted by God, okay? This is the view held by some Mormons, some Muslims, and even some Christians. So that's position 1. It's never a sin. It's still not a sin. So I think that view is wrong. Position 2, God allowed, approved of, and even commanded polygamy. And this is based on how someone interprets the Mosaic Levirate law, where a brother has to marry his brother's wife and raise up offspring for him. And I plan on doing an entire episode just on the Levirate law. So if you've read the book of Ruth, that's what's happening there. And my position is that this is only required of unmarried men, but some people say that no, if you're a married man, you still have to obey this law, and I'm going to argue against that view in a future episode. But some people say, based on that reading of the Levirate law, God actually commands polygamy in these special cases. And they would also say that polygamy is then only forbidden in the New Testament. So some Christians would possibly hold that view. Position 3, God permitted polygamy prior to the giving of the law at Sinai, and then permitted but regulated it under Mosaic law. But it is only after the coming of Christ and the New Testament that it is explicitly forbidden. And this is probably the more common view that I see amongst Christians today. They basically say, polygamy, God didn't really like it, but he made provision for it. He was okay with it in the patriarchs. It wasn't actually sin. But after the New Testament, it really is sin then. Now, position 4, this is my position, and it's basically the position of John Calvin, Theodore Beza, R.J. Rushdoony, many other Reformed pastors, and it is this, that God forbid polygamy from the very beginning of creation. So it's always a sin, always has been, always will be, but he regulated it under Mosaic law, and I'm going to argue he actually forbid it as well. And although polygamy is always a sin against this natural law of creation, it is not a crime or a crime with penalties under Mosaic law the way other things are. So like sodomy, you get the death penalty, adultery, death penalty in some cases. So although it's not criminalized in that sense with a penalty, it is something forbidden under Mosaic law and under creational law, and still is sinful today. And the primary proof text for this would be Genesis 2:24, which Jesus quotes in Matthew 19:5. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So I'm going to spend really the rest of this episode unpacking my position 4, and giving you a number of reasons for it, and then also dealing with some of the common objections people have to this position. We'll look at David and another example. So reason number 1 why I believe position 4 is what the Bible teaches. And the first reason is this: the prohibition of polygamy is inherent to the very definition of marriage. So before the fall and before any human laws or customs existed, God declared that marriage is properly a one flesh union between one man and one woman for life. Jesus says that from the beginning, divorce was not permitted, but because of the hardness of men's hearts, God permitted divorce in cases of adultery, and in 1 Corinthians 7, it also says abandonment. Now, just because God commands something doesn't mean that everyone obeys it, of course. In fact, often we do the exact opposite of what God commands. And that is what we see unfold in the book of Genesis. So Lamech is the first polygamist, Genesis 4:19. And although this is a sinful violation of God's creational law, Lamech is genuinely married. It's real marriage. It's just an inferior form of marriage. So he's married to 2 wives, and he is required by that marriage covenant to fulfill his duties to both of them. R.J. Rushdoony says that there are no civil or criminal penalties in Mosaic law for polygamy, and then he has this kind of funny comment, probably because polygamy is its own punishment. Okay, I'll leave you to ponder that. However, once a man had committed the sin of polygamy, so he's in this marriage covenant, he's sworn an oath to fulfill these marriage duties, God gives additional laws, and this is a gracious giving of his law in Deuteronomy 21, 15 to 17, to protect and regulate these sinful marriages. But we got to remember here, God regulating something does not equal divine approval. So let's say this together. Regulation does not equal approval. Just because God says, here's what happens if someone steals, doesn't mean, okay, God's okay with stealing. If you think about it, what law would you come up with to protect these women if a man has already taken multiple wives? You could have him killed, but what would that do? That would leave these women without a husband. It would leave them vulnerable. You could require him to divorce all of his wives except one, but what would this do to the women? It would leave them basically like single mothers who are extremely vulnerable. So there's really not a lot of good options. The man has really painted himself and his wives into a corner. So God gives this Mosaic law to protect and regulate these marriages because you cannot unscramble the egg. Once the egg's been scrambled, you can't get it back into its shell. And this is actually extremely helpful to us today in how we deal with people, Muslims with multiple wives who become Christians. God has given us a divinely inspired way for how to deal with this. So, just to summarize, Genesis 2:24 prohibits polygamy, but because men break this law, God gives additional laws to regulate it. And this regulation is not approval of the institution, and in fact, the very need for regulation suggests that it is because it's a sinful corruption of God's creational law. Now, if you disagree that Genesis 2:24 prohibits polygamy, here's a little thought experiment. Imagine that a man decides he wants to marry a robot. Let's say it's a sex bot, an artificially intelligent robot that it looks like a woman. It's not a woman, it's a robot. And you think, this guy wants to marry his sex bot. And apparently, there are real cases of this in our society now. Pastor Doug wrote a whole funny book on this. What is it called? Ride, Sally, Ride. Funny book. So let's say that case comes before you. What passage are you going to use to arguing that marrying a sex bot violates God's law? Because there aren't any verses that talk about sex bots in the Bible. So how are you going to say this is sinful? My guess is that you would probably appeal to Genesis 2:24. And you'd probably say that marriage is between one man and one woman, and a robot is neither man nor woman, therefore it is forbidden. Well, that's basically the same argument I'm making against polygamy. I'm just emphasizing the one part, the one man and the one woman part of Genesis 2. So if you deny that Genesis 2:24 prohibits polygamy, I think you're kind of left vulnerable in these other cases because you cut yourself off from using those as proof texts. Second reason why I believe position 4. Leviticus 18:18 is an explicit prohibition against polygamy. And I just actually mentioned this in passing in the last episode, and there were some questions about it. So let me get into this one. And I just have to say up front, this is a bit more complicated because it requires us to look at the actual Hebrew text and the flow of the chapter in Hebrew. And if you have more questions about this, I can actually send you a more kind of scholarly article that lays some of this out. I can email that to you if you like. But here, let me give you the dumbed down version of it as best I can. So first, the context. Leviticus 18 is a list of laws prohibiting what the Bible calls various abominable customs of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. And even though those nations were not given the Mosaic law, God still judges them for violating these laws in Leviticus. Now, not every single law in Leviticus 18 is a creational law. For example, this chapter prohibits marrying your sister, but Cain married his sister, since that was really his only option, and that did not violate the original creational natural law. But eventually, as the human race grew, God set some boundaries for what we call the degrees of consanguinity within which you can marry. And Leviticus is going to list what those prohibitions are. So verses 6 through 17 of Leviticus 18 are all about not uncovering the nakedness of anyone who is, quote, near of kin. And then it goes on to define, well, what is near of kin? And if you look at the Hebrew, starting in verse 7 and going to verse 17, you'll see that every single verse begins with this Hebrew word, eravat, which means nakedness. And then when you get to verse 17, there is a little concluding summary phrase that ends that section. It says, they are near of kin to her, it is wickedness. So all of those verses, 6 to 17, deal with family bonds. Who is near of kin? It's giving the definition for what that is. But then when you come to our verse 18, that begins with a completely different word, and it marks the start of an actual new grammatical construction, which goes all the way to verse 23, ve'isha. So if you know Hebrew, the vav consecutive, it's probably the most common grammatical pattern you'll see. And so verses 18 to 23 all begin with this Hebrew vav conjunctive, this super common pattern. And so the content of all of those other verses, if you can read this in English, you'll see what is the context of those relationships. Well, these are all sexual relationships outside of the family bond. So 6 to 17 talks about near of kin, and then the verses after that talk about other relationships. So it forbids bestiality, it forbids homosexuality, and so forth. So the question then becomes, how do you translate verse 18? Which section is it a part of? So some translations put it in the section above, so the near of kin section, but I believe the Hebrew structure actually demands that it's part of the latter structure, the relationships outside of the family bond. So that's fairly obvious, I think, if you look at the grammatical construction of the Hebrew, and there's other arguments related to this that I can send you if you are interested. So in the New King James Version, which is the version that I tend to read most frequently, it says this, verse 18, nor, so it's translating that vav consecutive, that Hebrew particle vav, it's translating it as nor. So, nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive. So you see, it's actually interpreting the verse in its translation. It's saying, oh, this belongs as part of the section 6 to 17, which identifies this woman as a biological sister. So that's how the New King James takes it. However, this just does not fit with the whole Hebrew grammatical construction or the logical flow of the passage. Here's what one commentator says. Everywhere else, this phrase, Isha el achotah, which is a woman in addition to her sister, every other time that occurs in the Old Testament, this phrase is always used idiomatically in the distributive sense of one in addition to another, and nowhere else refers to literal sisters. And the same construction for a man, same thing, never refers to biological brothers. So given this fact, the word sister in Leviticus 18:18 should be interpreted, quote, broadly as any woman in addition to a first wife, in accord with the idiomatic use of the same expression everywhere else. So, the sister here in Leviticus 18:18 is not talking about a biological sister, but a religious sister, a fellow citizen amongst the people of God. You'll remember, it was already forbidden to marry a foreign woman who did not fear God. You can't marry idolatrous women, just like God forbids us, Christians, from marrying unbelievers. Christians, likewise, are only allowed to marry, quote, in the Lord. So we're only allowed to marry a sister in Christ. So a better translation, and one that is actually in the margin of some Bibles, is neither shalt thou take one wife to another to vex her. And if you think also about the logic of creating this rivalry, this vexation, it's not like, well, so long as they're not biological sisters, if you have two wives, they're not going to fight. No, what do we see in the Genesis accounts? Anytime there is two women, think of Sarah and Hagar, what is there? There's enmity, there is rivalry, there is conflict between these two women. So it'd be strange for it to only apply for some reason to a biological sister. So I think this fits best with the context, with the flow of the chapter, and I think the Hebrew grammar makes this really clear. This is the position of Rushdoony, and it goes back at least to the 1st century. So I believe this is the interpretation from the beginning, but we actually have other evidence that this is what early people interpreted as. So there was this find, the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're familiar with, and there's actually this temple scroll that we have, and if you look at it, they interpreted the law against multiplying wives in Deuteronomy 17 to mean that the king could only marry one woman. So I'll read you this quote from the temple scroll. So this is like a 1st century document. He may not take a wife from any of the nations. Rather, he must take himself a wife from his father's house, that is, from his father's family. He is not to take another wife in addition to her. No, she alone shall be with him as long as she lives. If she dies, then he may take himself another wife from his father's house, that is, his family. So the community at Qumran interpreted Deuteronomy 17, you shall not multiply wives, based on Leviticus 18:18, that it is only one wife he is allowed to take. And this makes sense, especially in light of what you read in Malachi, which is the last of the prophets, which holds up monogamous marriage as the only righteous option. So this is Malachi 2:15. It says this, "But did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? Well, he seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of his youth." So some Jewish writers actually think this is an allusion to Abraham, who he committed polygamy, he married a foreign woman, Hagar, and as a result, what did he have? He had ungodly offspring, or what Paul calls a son according to the flesh, namely Ishmael. So man is to have one wife, because God desires godly offspring. The son of promise was Isaac. And as the lives of the patriarchs and the monarchs like David, Solomon, etc. shows, polygamous marriages always lead to rivalries between sons, wives, and often when you read the monarchy period, the sons end up killing one another. So I don't think Malachi or Qumran or the New Testament is creating some kind of new morality for marriage. I think they're actually just reading the Torah and concluding that polygamy is sinful by definition. There are other reasons that the New Testament, from the New Testament, that we could get into. For example, I take Paul's requirement that an elder be a one-woman man to have allusions, connections to this kingly office, the law for kings in the Old Testament, because pastors are shepherds, shepherds are kings, elders are judges, kings are judges. So there's a lot more we could get into here. But for time's sake, let's look at some of the objections people have to this view. One objection is, doesn't God approve of polygamy in 2 Samuel 12:8? So this is the scene where Nathan confronts David for murdering Uriah and taking Bathsheba to be his wife. So I'm just going to read this section and then I'll kind of deal with some of the problems in this passage. 2 Samuel 12:7-9 says, "Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel and delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight?'" So some people who hold to positions 1 to 3 would say that in this passage, God is approving of polygamy and even participating in it by giving David Saul's wives and saying that he would have given David even more wives if that was not enough. So this is a common interpretation that people have, and there are lots of problems with this view. Let me just list a few of them. I have three problems here with this view. Number one, the language of God giving Saul's wives into David's bosom or arms does not necessitate a sexual or marital relationship. This is a common Hebrew idiom, and occasionally it can refer to sex, but more often, if you look it up, it is used to simply refer to someone holding something close to their body, and especially you'll see this recurrence of it referring to taking care of like a baby or a child. So it's this kind of paternal term. You're taking care of something. A second problem, and one that I think is really insurmountable to this view that God is approving of polygamy here and requires us to read this phrase in a non-sexual way, is that Leviticus 18:17 says this, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter." Now think about David. Who was he already married to? He was already married to Michal, Saul's daughter. And so if David married Saul's wife and or concubine, he would be explicitly breaking Leviticus 18:17. Scripture only lists one wife for Saul, Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz, and one concubine named Rizpah. And neither of them show up in any list of David's wives or his lineage. David marries a different Ahinoam of Jezreel, while he's on the run from Saul in 1 Samuel 25:43. So there are two problems that I think requires us to take this giving of Saul's wives into David's bosom as referring to the care and the provision that David now gave to them since he had replaced Saul as master of the house. So God is simply saying that all that belonged to King Saul was taken from him and it was placed into David's lap, placed right into his bosom. And so the phrase, "I also would have given you much more," it's not a reference to God saying, "Oh, I'm going to give you more wives." It's a reference to the whole of the list that God had given to David. Israel, Judah, the crown, all of Saul's possessions, all of that stuff that God gave David. He's saying, "And I would have given you more of that if you desired it." It's not specifically referring to, "I'm going to give you more wives." The third problem is, if God adding much more to David meant giving him more wives, then we would have to conclude that more wives are a blessing, because everything else in that list is a blessing from God. But that would run contrary to, as we've seen, the law of creation and every other single text and example of polygamy in Scripture. So I just don't see how this is a legitimate or even possible reading of the text. Another objection that people sometimes put forward is the case of Joash in 2 Chronicles 24. And it says this, "Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And Jehoiada took 2 wives for him, and he had sons and daughters." And then it goes on to describe what Joash did as king. So some take this to mean that Jehoiada gave Joash 2 wives at the same time, and since Joash is said to have done what was right in the sight of the Lord, it must mean that God approves of polygamy here. Well, there are lots of problems with this interpretation as well. I'll look at just a few of them. First, there is nothing here that requires us to read this in a polygamous way. For example, Joash could have had one wife, then she died, and then he was given another wife. Okay, that's a totally lawful possibility, and Jehoiada is the one who arranged maybe for these godly wives for the king. That's one at least grammatically possible reading of the text. Another possible reading, and one that I think is more likely, is that Hebrew conjunctive vav, so this is that same vav again, in verse 3 is more properly translated as but instead of and. So you remember earlier, the New King James translated the vav as nor, so it can be translated lots of different things depending on the context. But here, it could be actually properly translated as but instead of and. So in this case, it would actually be saying that Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but he took 2 wives. And this would actually be a condemnation then of the king's polygamous relationship, and it would agree with the law of Leviticus 18:18 and Qumran's interpretation of the law forbidding kings from multiplying wives. Another thing we have to remember is that phrase, doing what is right in the sight of the Lord, never means that the king was sinless. This is a common refrain that you'll find in Kings and Chronicles, and it refers to the king's general loyalty to God, not whether they were personally, morally perfect. So, for example, in 1 Kings 11:5-6, it says this, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites." So Solomon's going after foreign gods. And then it says in verse 6, "Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David." So here it's saying Solomon didn't fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Now, you think about this for a second. Did David fully follow the Lord? Well, in the sense of he committed murder and adultery, no, he did not fully follow the Lord there. So we must conclude that the use of this phrase is not talking about the king's personal holiness. It's talking about whether the king admitted, permitted, committed idolatry. So that's what is in view, and you can read that in the context of how it describes whether the king did what was right or what he did evil. The next thing it's going to talk about is what they did to establish right worship, or did they continue the evil worship, the idolatrous worship like the nations. So in Joash's case, we are told in the parallel passage of 2 Kings 12 that there were actually some things he left undone. So 2 Kings 12 says this, Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. But the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So you see pretty much every time you see this, did they do right? Did they do evil in the sight of the Lord? It's connected to loyalty to Jehovah, and what did he do in regards to idolatrous worship? So depending on which reading you take of 2 Chronicles 24, even if Joash had committed polygamy, the phrase, Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord, really doesn't have that in view, because the same is said of David, and he committed far greater sins like murder and adultery, and yet he is said to have done what was right in the sight of God. So let me conclude finally by summarizing my answer to our original question. When did polygamy become a sin? Polygamy became a sin by definition when God instituted marriage in Genesis 2 as a covenantal union between one man and one woman. Lamech, Abraham, Jacob, all those who lived before the Mosaic law were sinning against this natural or creational law. And they experienced the consequences for their sin, namely the division of their household, division between children as well. We could look at polygamy and the lives of these men as sort of cautionary tales for all of us to learn from. Also, we should just note here that Genesis 50:20 sums up the book when Joseph says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." And that's the story of history, right? They killed Christ, but God turned this evil thing in history for the good of the world. So although the patriarchs' polygamous marriages were very sinful, God still actually worked it for good. Eventually, the Messiah was born from the line of Judah. However, God working evil for good is not an argument for us to do evil, right? So just because you're Joseph's brother and this is going to work out to save the world doesn't mean that it was righteous for you to throw him into a pit and sell him into slavery, okay? Now, once God gave the Mosaic law, I think the evidence is overwhelming that Leviticus 18:18 is an explicit prohibition against polygamy. But just like many other sins, it is never criminalized and given a penalty like other sins are, such as bestiality, sodomy, etc. The New Testament confirms this reading of the Torah in how it speaks of marriage. And of course, God is not polygamous. Marriage is a picture of Christ's love for the church, and Christ has only one bride. And we are his image bearers, and we are to reflect that faithful monogamy in our own marriage. So that's position number 4. I believe that is what the Bible teaches. And if you still have questions after this or would like to see a more in-depth defense of some of these things, as I said, please do email me at aventura@christkirk.com. I'm happy to send you a PDF article that goes into more technical depth on this. And my hope is that in the hopefully near future, I can put some of this stuff all on a website. So it can just be like your source. I can put up maybe even my manuscripts of these episodes. So if you don't want to listen to it over again, you could read it, you could send it to your friends. And then I can also put, here's resources for future study, books that go more in depth into these things. So that's all hopefully we'll have to talk about on polygamy for now. I will plan on doing an episode on the Levirate law in the future. And if you have other ideas for episodes, questions, that kind of thing, please do continue to email me or use the Google form in the show notes. And also, don't forget to share this podcast with people who could benefit from it. It's great to get this content out into the world. So please do share it, like it, review us on iTunes, but only if you have a good review to say. I want only 5-star reviews, please. So all of that to say, until next time, keep on reading.